First, I want to thank Pacific Life and the organizers for the invitation. And as Judy said, I'm contracted by the University of Hawaii to work at NOAA Southwest Fisheries Science Center in Pacific Grove. And we just very recently were invited to join this panel, but we were instantly interested in attending because we're a bunch of oceanographers, primarily up there in Pacific Grove. And although we do lots of interesting oceanographic research, it's much more fun when you integrate it with other components that we are mandated with as well in regards to protected resources, and synergize that way and make it that much more valuable. So what I wanted to do today is just give a broad review and overview, not necessarily of anything that I work directly with, but drawing from programs that have been involved in directly or indirectly, or aspects of work that have direct competence with the work we do at our lab. So the roadmap for the time that I'll be talking is, first I'll give a quick review of the scales and processes of climatic variability in the ocean and the ecosystem response. So that's basically to get everyone on the same footing. I realize that people may have different backgrounds. So for some people it may be very basic, for some people it may be the very first time that are seeing this. Then Judy wanted me to talk a little bit about coffee, and I was trying to fit it into the context of what I felt was relevant. So I'm going to talk about the GOOS, which are the Global Observing Systems, Ocean Observing Systems, and coffee fits into that context, and we'll see how. Then a little bit about how climate change relates to marine mammals, and that is primarily drawing from my work with the International Whaling Commission on workshops, a number of workshops that have been conducted on assessing the climate impact on marine mammals. And finally, I'll provide some conclusions. So, just to give you a little bit of background too, in 2009, we were contacted by Bob DeLong, who does sea lion studies in the Channel Islands, about a mortality event that was going on, some pretty large, concerning, and he wanted to know if there was anything going on with the oceanography, with the ocean environment. So we looked into it, and sure enough, there were a number of things going on. El Nino was developing in the tropics, and people were already jumping to the conclusion that this mortality was due to El Nino. But the fact that El Nino really initially develops in the tropics, but it takes several months to travel up the west coast, it just would not match the timing of the mortality. But looking deeper, there were other events going on that are not of equatorial origin. They originate up in the higher latitudes in the subarctic. And then they sort of have certain impacts that affect the upwelling in the west coast. And upwelling really is the driver of productivity in the west coast and the food for the sea lions. So if there was any environmental relationship, it was probably more due to a disruption of upwelling that we did see at that time of the year. This was during the pupping season in April. So just to give you a sense, the first scale that I will be briefly mentioning to you, everybody should be familiar with this, is the seasonality. The ocean goes through marked seasonality, and in this case I'm using the example of upwelling of the west coast at measured at 30, sorry, okay, I'm getting mixed up. So measured at 33 degrees north, which is basically where we are right now, at the coast, and what we see is for about 2 years, we see what the seasonal cycle of upwelling is. So the purple band is sort of the long-term average, and the black fine line is the actual observations in from 2008 to 2010. So we see that there's the upwelling cycle does follow that pattern of spring and summer increased upwelling. So that's when we see a lot of the productivity in the California current. And that's one of the drivers then of the system, at least this system in particular. If I can get out of here.
Here we got it. There you go.
Okay. Well, beyond the seasonal cycle, there's other forcers, drivers of the system And also familiar to many people, there's El Nino, and more often we hear the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. These are cycles that have longer frequencies. So we're talking about El Nino, maybe in a decade we see 3 events or so. And the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, as the name implies, we can see, if you look through the decades, we have runs of warm, above average years that last for 10, 20 years, and then cool years. Some different scales at which they take place. It's not just that the temporal scale is different, but that the spatial scale is as well. The El Nino primarily takes place in the equatorial Pacific. This is a La Nina condition of cooler than normal and warmer than normal conditions. The Pacific Decadal Oscillation takes place primarily off the tropics, extratropics, so, and primarily in the northern hemisphere, where we have sort of a dipole or contrasting conditions between the Gulf of Alaska and coastal west coast of North America, and then the central and western Pacific. And these kind of events or phenomena have very strong impacts on the ecosystem structure. So in this case, we have a time series of abundance of or biomass of a euphosid, Nyctiphonis, in Southern California for a long time. And we see that there's negative anomalies, so it's below normal conditions, for a long time between the 1920s and the 1977 or so, and then we have a shift to above normal, and then again. And this correlates pretty well with the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. And similarly, other components of the ecosystem that have to do with zooplankton, etc. So these organisms being at the base of the food chain, of course, are what's going to structure the rest of the ecosystem, and then we're going to be seeing a response in the apertrophic levels. So getting beyond interannual and decadal oscillations, what else is there? Well, we're talking about long-term trends and possibly climate change. And the interesting thing is that no matter where you look at in the ocean, if you have a long time series that goes back to maybe 1800s, but at least going back to the 1950s or so, if you run some statistical analysis to extract signals out of that, you will find a pattern, which I'll show you right now. It's this pattern here. These are 4 different time series, and essentially the same pattern is extracted there. Notice that there's no axis here because this is basically, or axis units, because it's eight-dimensional at this point. It's just for illustration purposes. However, this pattern has been isolated out of a very noisy time series. There's a lot of components in this time series. This is actually the Southern Oscillation Index, going back to the late 1800s. So through statistical techniques, we can actually decompose a time series like that and isolate the El Nino itself, the El Nino phenomenon over that long time period, separate from what is the actual trend. And what we see, of course, is that in 1950 or so, we see a very strong acceleration in that, what we call the warming trend. Whether it's anthropogenic or not, that's not something we can say, but most likely it's what it is. Now, there's an interesting thing. People talk about how with global warming, we'll be seeing stronger El Niños and more frequent El Niños. Well, from this analysis that we did a few years ago, what we found is that up to this point at least, El Nino is not necessarily getting stronger. Not necessarily getting more frequent. The frequency itself is not changing and seems to be fixed, but what is different is that if you overimpose these 2 series, what you get is that the El Nino are riding on a climbing long-term trend, which means that we'll get higher and higher El Nino events, so stronger and stronger El Nino events. Okay, moving along. So the global warming signal itself, there's a lot of work being done on projections for what the climate might look like and how it might impact the oceans. So the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, generates these official forecasts or projections of what climate change might look like on the different scenarios depending on the carbon emissions. So we will see that the ocean will change differently. It's not like the whole ocean is going to change uniformly. We will have areas that have strong changes, maybe around here, and less change. Antarctica seems to, east of the Antarctic Peninsula, probably very strongly affected. So, on top of that, we have human impact. So humans have become a driver of the ocean as well. And for instance, we have fishing pressure. And this is a projection using the climate projection that we saw before as the environmental driver of what the fish abundance may look like under these climate projections. So what we see is that in reds and oranges and yellows is where fisheries yield will actually decline, and in blues where fisheries yield will actually increase. So again, this has very important implications, not just for humans in terms of what we will be extracting out of the oceans, but for all the organisms, especially marine mammals, which were concerned in this meeting as well. Other human pressures. So this was an interesting study, a series of studies published in 2008 and 2009 out of NC's in Santa Barbara, where they looked at climate change and human impacts like fisheries, shipping traffic, runoff and nutrient loading from continental sources that are from agriculture. And this map, I don't really like the color scheme very much because it's very hard to pick out regions, but basically what we see is that the more yellow and bright red you get, the more cumulative impacts the oceans will experience, or have experienced, because this is up to present time actually, in different parts of the world. So what we see again is that humans have become an important driving force in the oceans, as we have to take that into account in that certain areas will be more impacted than others. And the scale of this map doesn't really show it, but let's go to the next slide, which is just the West Coast, primarily Pacific. We're very Pacific-centric, and after all, at the Pacific Life Foundation here. So let's look at the West Coast. So we see that definitely there's patterns there of cumulative impacts, and here they're broken down by source. This is climate due to warming, and land input, fishing, and this is shipping. You can see the shipping lanes pretty clearly. So if you overlay and average or add them up or whatever treatment you give them, you get this kind of pattern. And even this map doesn't show it really well, but basically, if you were to zoom in here, you would see that there's a very fine line bordering the coast where there's going to be the strongest impacts are going to be right along the coast. If you see very bright red, if you were to zoom in one of those. So again, we're trying to give this sort of ecosystem perspective, just kind of like getting a whole picture of what the oceans might look under all these kinds of forcings that we're experiencing. So moving on to the next topic of ocean sampling programs. Starting with Cal Coffey. Cal Coffey was really the granddaddy of all the ocean sampling programs, and it's still going, and it's an amazing source of data, and hordes of people have built their careers on Cal Coffey. But essentially it was originated out of the fact that the sardine fishery collapsed, and then the state of California and a number of agencies got together to see, okay, what's going on? Is it environmentally driven? What's going on? So they devised this sampling program. Each of these dots are stations that were occupied. Initially, they were done monthly. This was a huge, huge undertaking. And it went from north of San Francisco, almost up in, almost near Oregon, all the way down to Baja. It covered this entire part of the ocean. And at each of those stations, a number of sampling protocols were conducted, including measuring chemical and physical aspects of the ocean, but also net sampling, looking at plankton and fish, etc. So due to all the funding restrictions, etc., over the years, coffee has been reduced, and since 1984, these dots are the current grid that are occupied, and it's done on a quarterly basis. So and the background is an image of ocean color chlorophyll concentration, just showing how dynamic the region is. And it won't do any justice, but just to show you one example of things that we can learn from this kind of sampling programs. This they call coffee grid. If we take just one station here, and we look at one particular depth of interest, which is at the 26.4 density level, which is indicative of the California undercurrent, which happens to have a lot of nutrients, and therefore is sort of the source water for the upwelling and the ecosystem that sits up in this area. What we see over the period from 1984 to present is this very clear trends, not just in temperature and stratification, which we know is already taking place in the ocean, but the nutrients themselves are changing. This is apparent oxygen utilization, nitrate, phosphate, and this nitrogen to phosphate ratio. So these things are telling us that the fertilizers of the system, if you will, are going through some pretty strong changes at the longer scale. And I'm not making any emphasis on that, but on this. But there's a lot of variability in there as well. And part of the work we do is trying to understand these smaller cycles as well. They may also have relevance. So all these different scales have relevance for what we're trying to understand, and trying to link them up to different events or different population trends, etc. is the challenge that we work on. Okay, another example, and this is what Lisa Balance would have presented if she was here, is from the Protected Resources Division of Southwest Fisheries Science Center. It's another really exemplary program that was started in the 1980s, mid-1980s, and different to CalCoffee, which is basically a program that samples the oceanography and sort of the lower trophic levels with some. CalCoffee actually does some marine mammal sampling as well, some seabirds and marine mammals. This program was specifically designed to monitor cetacean populations. Initially in the Eastern Tropical Pacific, there's work off the west coast of the United States and also in the Hawaiian Islands. So this was specifically to sample the marine mammals populations, but they conduct full ecosystem sampling. So this is a little bit of the conceptual scheme of how it's done. They do sample, as I mentioned earlier, the physical and biological variables of the habitat, but also the low and mid-trophic levels, and of course the apex predators, which would be the marine mammals and seabirds. And all these data is used for a number of things that are mandated for NMFS, including, of course, generating the abundance estimates of the populations of concern. But those data can be used in an ecosystem's context as well, because over the years, you can see shifts and changes in habitat utilization. So this example is showing the normal distribution of Dall's porpoises, which occupy the cooler waters of the North Pacific. But in certain years, they actually extend their range down. And this has been observed due to the fact that these surveys have been going on for so long that they are able to capture some of these events. Likewise, common dolphins, this is sort of what you'd call the normal range. But then in certain years, not hard to imagine like El Nino, they would be expanding further out. So again, this has actually been documented. So these were examples of programs that were originally designed for very specific purposes, but nowadays there's this sort of initiative on a global scale to integrate all those efforts that different agencies and different organizations are doing to have what's being called the Global Ocean Observing System. So in reality, Cal Coffee, the current Cal Coffee, is being integrated with the rebirth of Cal Coffee in Baja, which is now called Imeco Cal and is run by Mexico, and other lines that have been historically occupied along the West Coast to have full coverage of the West Coast. And the idea then is that we're not just sampling groundfish or something, we're sampling the physics and the geology and the bathymetry, etc. at the bottom, but there's all kinds of layers, if you will, of variables that can help us make more informed decisions about what the whole ecosystem is going through. So this is sort of a vision of what the goose people think of the oceans and how they will look eventually. It's a bunch of wired instruments and bottom-mounted arrays, buoys that transmit to satellites and airplanes, and again, satellites that are doing environmental monitoring, along with what originally started as ship surveys that were sampling very limited areas. And John Hildebrandt showed us great examples of how the technology and the electronics are really going to revolutionize how we measure the oceans. And there's some political aspects of that as well. Of course, how do you implement this on a large scale? It's through regional associations that will be sort of staking out their own territories. And then even on a global scale, there's a network of buoys and floats and drifters and ship routes that are fixed and so on. How am I doing on time?
Okay, fine.
Okay. This should be the last part, so maybe a couple more minutes, maybe 3 minutes, 4 minutes. So going back to the issue of climate change, of course, the fact that we've had these sampling programs actually have enabled us to detect changes in the environment that are consistent with climate change. And the International Whaling Commission has been concerned about the environmental impacts on cetaceans for a long time. But starting in 1996, there was the first workshop on cetaceans and climate change, CC1, that took place in Hawaii. Then we had a second one in Siena, Italy in 2009. And just less than 2 months ago, there was a third one in Vienna, Austria, that focused specifically on small cetaceans. So going into these workshops, we already knew certain things. For instance, we already know that the main impacts of climate on cetaceans are primarily going to be due to reduced prey density or availability, and also to the ability of the cetaceans to switch prey. However, there's also going to be some health-related stressors. For instance, even though the thermal impact, because the animals are in warmer waters, may not necessarily be a direct effect, there are probably going to be effects that are due to compounding pathogens that in a warmer environment might reduce the resistance. The pathways of exposure might get enhanced because we get pathogens that may be only in tropical areas expanding into subtropical areas. And also the fact that with more pollution, there's going to be a weakening of immune systems and so on. So it's a compound indirect effect. Going into these workshops, we also are aware that there's what's called tertiary effects, and that is effects that are due or expected to take place because humans will change their habits with climate change. So in other words, even let's say that San Francisco gets flooded or something, people change the way they use the environment in a way that is going to put an added stressor that we are not aware of at this point. And also talk about mitigation and adaptation. These two words come up a lot in the climate circles. Mitigation is basically reducing, for instance, carbon emissions. There's not much that we can say about that. And adaptation is something that comes a lot from the terrestrial environment, but I see John out there. For sea turtles, it's actually viable, where you can actually do on-the-ground actions that can help, for instance, nesting beaches to relocate nests or provide shade, things like that that would potentially have some compensatory effect. But when we start talking about things like this for cetaceans, it's a whole other bag, and basically, which is something that the concept is really applicable, because we're talking about animals that are living in open offshore waters, and we just can't keep track of that. So these workshops, of course, have the background to them has been the IPCC assessments, and over that time period there have been 2 of them that have, each of them has produced unequivocal evidence that climate change is taking place. And then what the realization has been is that at this point there are many uncertainties about how climate change is acting on a more local scale to even be able to predict what the impact will be on cetaceans. So a lot of the work we've been trying to do is sort of from the ground level, start identifying gaps. Okay, what are we missing to be able to generate predictions using the IPCC predictions, generate predictions of what impacts might take place on cetacean populations. We do know that, however that modeling takes place, it should focus on mechanisms rather than just looking at correlations. And as I mentioned, a lot of the work has been on identifying data gaps, which are huge. Another big effort, and we've spent a lot of time with that, is looking at the existence, trying to identify which data sets are out there that could be used as indicators of climate change on cetaceans. And there are a few. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip that slide, but I will say that we have identified some criteria. They should have a duration of at least 20 to 30 years, temporal resolution or sampling of at least annually. That's harder to accomplish in real life, but that would be ideal. Spatial scales covering from the habitat, the local habitat, to the entire population range. So I'm going to skip that. And I'm probably going to skip that as well. Jumping to conclusions then, the largest impacts will be in coastal areas near urban centers and heavily polluted watersheds. And that actually comes out of those Halpern studies, but it's also something that is realized by most people who are working on climate issues and environmental issues, is that basically the human impact is becoming as large or as larger as we can see from the warming itself. So we're talking about other impacts aside from warming. But at the same time, the coastal zone is where we actually can do something, as opposed to trying to protect populations that are found in offshore waters. And also, from a practical and political perspective, when you start trying to implement, if you try to do something, you need some management jurisdiction in order to be able to do it. So trying to do something in the Arctic is going to be very, very difficult unless we have some clear jurisdictions, or in international waters. And then the assets that are more important to monitor and protect through planning have been identified as connectivity and resilience of the ecosystems. So these 2 properties are key for a healthy ecosystem, where connectivity means that, say, a population of fish that lay eggs in, say, the kelp, but then migrates down to 200 meters, there's going to be connection between those eggs and the adult population that's farther deep. So preserving those corridors, whatever they may be. Resilience is the ability of a population to return to its normal circumstance after some disruption. So a healthy ecosystem is one that has resilience, and that's what we should be aiming to maintain. This is the last slide. As far as marine mammals, in most regions, protection will probably have to be achieved indirectly through maintenance of ecosystem function. So basically what I mentioned before, just because we won't have the resources to do anything about many populations. To paraphrase the second Halpern study, ocean management needs to move beyond single sector management and towards comprehensive ecosystem-based management if it is to be effective at protecting and sustaining ocean habitat. Thank you.